This lecture is on Chapter 3, A Concise History of SQL. I will cover the origins of SQL, early vendor implementations of SQL, and the evolution of the ANSI ISO standard for SQL. As you may recall, in Lesson 1, we learned of the definition of a relational database model as defined by Dr. E.F. Codd in 1970. Subsequently, in the early 1970s, IBM started a project to prove the viability of the relational model, to develop a working relational database, and to define a language for the database. In 1974, Dr. Donald Chamberlain defined the structured query language called SQL. It was defined on a database called SQL XRM. From 1976 to 1977, the language went through a few transformations. The name changed from SQL to SQL2 to SQL, and the database was called System R. The project was also called System R, and it ended in 1979. During the System R project by IBM, which ended in 1979, earlier in 1977, the company Relational Software Incorporated was established in Menlo Park, California, by Larry Ellison and Bob Miner. The database that they developed was called Oracle. It was running on a mini computer called Digital's VAX, which is very different from the System R project, which was running on IBM's mainframe. In 1979, the product went to market. In 1983, the company changed its name from Relational Software Incorporated to Oracle. Another implementation of SQL occurred at the Berkeley Computer Laboratories at the University of California by Dr. Michael Stonebreaker and Eugene Wong. They established the database Ingress, and the language they developed is called QUEL. In 1980, they left the University of California and established the Relational Technology Incorporated Company. In 1981, a year later after establishing the business, they offered their first commercial version of Ingress. Ingress is now owned by Actium. Meanwhile, when System R project ended in 1979, what was IBM doing? Well, in 1981, IBM developed the database SQL Data System. It was shipped out in 1982. In 1983, it was renamed to its current name, which is DB2. In 1985, it was shipped out. It ran on an IBM mainframe when it was shipped out in 1985. With the emergence of different databases and different versions of database languages defined by the vendors, it became apparent in the early 1980s that a standard was needed for the structured query language. In 1982, the American National Standards Institute took on this responsibility. The language was later updated in 1986, and later the International Organization for Standardization also agreed on a national standardization of SQL that aligned with the American National Standards Institute standardization of SQL. So going forward, SQL in 1989 was a standardization of both the ANSI and ISO. The next version to be released as an ANSI ISO standard was SQL 1992 with 3 levels: entry-level, intermediate level, and full level. Finally, from 1997 to 2016, 12 parts have been defined for the SQL language in agreement by the ANSI and ISO organizations. In closing, we have covered the origins of SQL beginning with IBM, followed by early vendor implementations such as Oracle and Actian, and we have briefly discussed the evolution of the standardization of the SQL language. This week's assignment is just a quiz on Chapter 3.